So long and thanks for all the fish. Prologue. Far out in the uncharted backwaters of the unfashionable end of the western spiral arm of the galaxy lies a small, unregarded yellow sun. Orbiting this at the distance of roughly 98 million miles is an utterly insignificant little blue-green planet whose ape-descended life forms are so amazingly primitive that they still think digital watches are a pretty neat idea. This planet has, or rather had, a problem, which was this. Most of the people living on it were unhappy for pretty much of the time. Many solutions were suggested for this problem, but most of these were largely concerned with the movements of small green pieces of paper, which is odd because on the whole it wasn't the small green pieces of paper that were unhappy. And so the problem remained. Lots of people were mean, and most of them were miserable, even the ones with digital watches. Many were increasingly of the opinion that they'd all made a big mistake in coming down from the trees in the first place. And some said that even the trees had been a bad move and that no one should have ever left the oceans. And then, one Thursday, nearly 2,000 years after one man had been nailed to a tree for saying how great it would be to be nice to people for a change, a girl sitting on her own in a small cafe in Ricksmanworth suddenly realized what it was that had been going wrong all this time. And she finally knew how the world could be made a good and happy place. This time it was right, it would work, and no one would have to get nailed to anything. Sadly, however, before she could get to a phone to tell anyone about it, the Earth was unexpectedly demolished to make way for a new hyperspace bypass, and so the idea was lost, seemingly forever. This is her story. Chapter 1. That evening it was dark early, which was normal for that time of year. It was cold and windy, which was normal. It started to rain, which was particularly normal. A spacecraft landed, which was not. There was nobody around to see it except for some spectacularly stupid quadrupeds who hadn't the faintest idea what to make of it, or whether they were meant to make anything of it, or eat it, or what. So they did what they did to everything, which was to run away from it and try to hide under each other, which never worked. It slipped down out of the clouds, seeming to be balanced on a single beam of light. From a distance you would scarcely have noticed it through the lightning and storm clouds, but seen from close up it was strangely beautiful, a gray craft of elegantly sculpted form, quite small. Of course, no one has ever had the slightest notion of what shape or size different species are going to turn out to be. But if you were to take the findings of the latest mid-galactic census report as any kind of accurate guide to statistical averages, you would probably guess that the craft would hold about 6 people, and you'd be right. You'd probably guess that anyway. The census report, like most such surveys, had cost an awful lot of money and had told nobody anything they didn't already know, except that every single person in the galaxy had 2.4 legs and owned a hyena. Since this was clearly not true, the whole thing eventually had to be scrapped. The craft slid quietly through the rain, its dim operating lights seeming to wrap it in tasteful rainbows. It hummed very quietly, a hum that became gradually louder and deeper as it approached the ground, and which, at an altitude of 6 inches, became a heavy throb. At last it dropped, and was quiet. A hatchway opened. A short flight of steps unfolded itself. A light appeared in the opening, a bright light streaming out into the wet night, and shadows moved within. A tall figure appeared in the light, looked around, flinched, and hurried down the steps, carrying a large shopping bag under his arm. He turned and gave a single abrupt wave back to the ship. Already the rain was streaming through his hair. "Thank you," he called out. "Thank you very—" He was interrupted by a sharp crack of thunder. He glanced up apprehensively, and in response to a sudden thought, started quickly to rummage through the large plastic shopping bag, which he had now discovered had a hole in the bottom. It had large characters printed on the side, which read, to anyone who could decipher the Centaurian alphabet, "Duty-free Mega Mart, Port Brasta, Alpha Centauri. Be like the 22nd elephant with the heated value in space. Bark." "Hold on," the figure called, waving at the ship. The steps, which had started to fold themselves back through the hatchway, stopped, re-unfolded, and allowed him back in. He emerged a few seconds later carrying a battered and threadbare towel, which he shoved into the bag. He waved again, hoisted the bag under his arm, and started to run for the shelter of some trees as, behind him, the spacecraft had already begun its ascent. Lightning flitted through the sky and made the figure pause for a moment, then hurry onward, revising his path to give the trees a wide berth. He moved swiftly across the ground, slipping here and there, hunching himself against the rain which was falling now with ever-increasing concentration, as if being pulled from the sky. His feet sloshed through the mud. Thunder grumbled over the hills. He pointlessly wiped the rain off his face and stumbled on. More lights. Not lightning this time, but more diffused and dimmer lights which played slowly over the horizon and faded. The figure paused again on seeing them and then redoubled his steps, making directly toward the point on the horizon at which they had appeared. And now the ground was becoming steeper, sloping upward, and after another 200 or 300 yards, it led at last to an obstacle. The figure paused to examine the barrier and then dropped the bag over it before climbing over it himself. Hardly had the figure touched the ground on the other side than there came a machine sweeping out of the rain toward him, with light streaming through the wall of water. The figure pressed back as the machine streaked toward him. It was a low, bulbous shape, like a small whale surfing, sleek, gray, and rounded, and moving at terrifying speed. The figure instinctively threw up his hands to protect himself, but was hit only by a sluice of water as the machine swept past and off into the night. It was illuminated briefly by another flicker of lightning crossing the sky, which allowed the soaked figure by the roadside a split second to read the small sign at the back of the machine before it disappeared. To the figure's apparent incredulous astonishment, the sign read, "My other car is also a Porsche." Chapter 2. Rob McKenna was a miserable bastard, and he knew it, because he'd had a lot of people pointed out to him over the years, and he saw no reason to disagree with them except the obvious one, which was that he liked disagreeing with people, particularly people he disliked, which included, at last count, everybody. He heaved a sigh and shoved down a gear. The hill was beginning to steepen, and his lorry was heavy with Danish thermostatic radiator controls. It wasn't that he was naturally predisposed to be so surly, at least he hoped not. It was just that the rain got him down. Always the rain. It was raining now just for a change. It was a particular type of rain that he particularly disliked, particularly when he was driving. He had a number for it. It was rain type 17. He had read somewhere that the Eskimos had over 200 different words for snow, without which their conversation probably would have gotten very monotonous. So they would distinguish between thin snow and thick snow, light snow and heavy snow, sludgy snow, brittle snow, snow that came in flurries, snow that came in drifts, snow that came in on the bottom of your neighbor's boots all over your nice clean igloo floor, the snows of winter, the snows of spring, the snows you remember from your childhood that were so much better than any of your modern snow. Fine snow, feathery snow, hill snow, valley snow, snow that falls in the morning, snow that falls at night, snow that falls all of a sudden just when you were going out fishing, and snow that, despite all of your efforts to train them, the huskies have pissed on. Rob McKenna had 231 different types of rain entered in his little book, and he didn't like any of them. He shifted down another gear and the lorry heaved its revs up. It grumbled in a comfortable sort of way about all the Danish thermostatic radiator controls it was carrying. Since he had left Denmark the previous afternoon, he had been through types 33, light prickling drizzle which made the road slippery, 39, heavy spotting, 47 to 51, vertical light drizzle through to sharply slanting light to moderate drizzle freshening, 87 and 88, two finely distinguished varieties of vertical torrential downpour, 100, post-downpour squalling, cold, all the sea storm types between 192 and 213 at once, 123, 124, 126, 127, mild and intermediate cold gusting, regular and syncopated cab drumming, 11, breezy droplets, and now his least favorite of all, 17. Rain type 17 was a dirty bladder battering against his windshield so hard that it didn't make much odds whether he had his wipers on or off. He tested this theory by turning them off briefly, but as it turned out, the visibility did get quite a lot worse. It just failed to get better again when he turned them back on. In fact, one of the wiper blades began to flap off. Swish, 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 flop, swish, swish, flop, swish, swish, flop, swish, flop, swish, flop, 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 scrape. He pounded his steering wheel, kicked the floor, thumped his cassette player until it suddenly started playing Barry Manilow, thumped it again until it stopped again, and swore and swore and swore and swore and swore. It was at this very moment that his fury was peaking that there loomed swimmingly in his headlights, hardly visible through the bladder, a figure by the roadside. A poor bedraggled figure, strangely attired, wetter than an otter in a washing machine, and hitching. Poor miserable sod, thought Rob McKenna to himself, realizing that here was somebody with a better right to feel hard done by than himself. Must be chilled to the bone. Stupid to be out hitching on a filthy night like this. All you get is cold, wet, and lorries driving through puddles at you. He shook his head grimly, heaved another sigh, gave the wheel a turn, and hit a large sheet of water square on. See what I mean? He thought to himself as he plowed swiftly through it. You get some right bastards on the road. Splattered in his rearview mirror a couple of seconds later was the reflection of the hitchhiker, drenched by the roadside. For a moment, he felt good about this. A moment or two later, he felt bad about feeling good about it. Then he felt good about feeling good about it and, satisfied, drove on into the night. At least he made up for it, finally having been overtaken by that Porsche he had been diligently blocking for the last 20 miles. And as he drove on, the rain clouds dragged down the sky after him, for, though he did not know it, Rob McKenna was a rain god. All he knew was that his working days were miserable, and he had a succession of lousy holidays. All the clouds knew was that they loved him and wanted to be near him, to cherish him and to water him. Chapter 3. The next two lorries were not driven by rain gods, but they did the exact same thing. The figure trudged, or rather sloshed, onward, till the hill resumed and the treacherous sheet of water was left behind. After a while, the rain began to ease, and the moon put in a brief appearance from behind the clouds. A Renault drove by, and its driver made frantic and complex signals to the trudging figure to indicate that normally he would have been delighted to give the figure a lift, only he couldn't this time because he was going in the direction that the figure wanted to go, because he wasn't going in the direction that the figure wanted to go, whatever direction that might be, and he was sure the figure would understand. He concluded the signaling with a cheery thumbs-up sign, as if to say that he hoped the figure felt really fine about being cold and almost terminally wet, and he would catch him the next time around. The figure trudged on. A Fiat passed and did exactly the same as the Renault. A Maxi passed on the other side of the road and flashed its lights at the slowly plodding figure, though whether this was meant to convey a hello, or sorry we're going the other way, or a hey look, there's someone in the rain, what a jerk, was entirely unclear. A green strip across the top of the windshield indicated that whatever the message was, it came from Steve and Carola. The storm had now definitely abated, and what thunder there was now grumbled from more over distant hills, like a man saying, and another thing, 20 minutes after admitting he'd lost the argument. The air was clearer now, the night cold. Sound traveled rather well. The lost figure, shivering desperately, presently reached a junction, where a side road turned off to the left. Opposite the turning stood a signpost, and this figure suddenly hurried to it and studied with feverish curiosity, only twisting away from it as another car passed suddenly, and another. The first whisked by with complete disregard, and the second flashed meaninglessly. A Ford Cortina passed and put on its brakes. Lurching with surprise, the figure bundled his bag to his chest and hurried forward toward it, but at the last moment the Cortina spun its wheels in the wet and careened up off the road rather amusingly. The figure slowed to a stop and stood there, lost and dejected. As it chanced, the following day the driver of the Cortina went into the hospital to have his appendix out. Only due to a rather amusing mix-up, the surgeon removed his leg in error. Before the appendectomy could be rescheduled, The appendicitis complicated into an entertainingly serious case of peritonitis, and justice, in its way, was served. The figure trudged on. A sob drew to a halt beside him. Its window wound down and a friendly voice said, "Have you come far?" The figure turned toward it. He stopped and grasped the handle of the door. The figure in the car and its door handle were all on a planet called the Earth, a world whose entire entry in the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy was comprised of 2 words: mostly harmless. The man who wrote this entry was called Ford Prefect, and he was at this precise moment on a far from harmless world, sitting in a far from harmless bar, recklessly causing trouble. Chapter 4. Whether it was because he was drunk, ill, or suicidally insane would not have been apparent to a casual observer. And indeed, there were no casual observers in the old Pink Dog bar on the lower side of Hand-Old City, because it wasn't the sort of place you could afford to do things casually in if you wanted to stay alive. Any observers in the place would have been mean, hawk-like observers, heavily armed, with painful throbbings in their heads which caused them to do crazy things when they observed things they didn't like. One of those nasty hushes had descended on the place, a missile crisis sort of hush. Even the evil-looking bird perched on a rod in the bar had stopped screeching out the names and addresses of local contract killers, which was a service it provided for free. All eyes were on Ford Prefect. Some of them were on stocks. The particular way in which he was choosing to dice recklessly with death today was by trying to pay for a drink spill the size of a small defense budget with an American Express card, which was not acceptable anywhere in the known universe. "What are you worried about?" he asked in a cheery kind of voice. "The expiration date? Haven't you guys ever heard of neo-relativity out here? There's a whole new area of physics which can take care of this sort of thing. Time dilation effects, temporal rheostatics." "We're not worried about the expiration date," said the man to whom he addressed these remarks, who was a dangerous barman in a dangerous city. His voice was a low, soft purr, like the low, soft purr made by the opening of an ICBM silo. A hand like a side of meat tapped lightly on the bar top, lightly denting it. "Well, that's good then," said Ford, packing his satchel and preparing to leave. The tapping finger reached out and rested lightly on the shoulder of Ford Prefect. It prevented him from leaving. Although the finger was attached to a slab-like hand, and the hand was attached to a club-like forearm, the forearm wasn't attached to anything at all, except in the metaphorical sense that it was attached by a fierce dog-like loyalty to the bar, which was its home. It had previously been more conventionally attached to the original owner of the bar, who on his deathbed had unexpectedly bequeathed it to medical science. Medical science had decided they didn't like the look of it and had bequeathed it right back to the old Pink Dog bar. The new barman didn't believe in the supernatural or poltergeists or anything kooky like that. He just knew a useful ally when he saw one. The hand sat on the bar. It took orders, it served drinks, it dealt murderously with people who behaved as if they wanted to be murdered. Ford Prefect sat still. "We are not worried about the expiration date," repeated the barman, satisfied that now he had Ford Prefect's full attention. "We are worried about the entire piece of plastic." "What?" said Ford. He seemed a little taken aback. "This," said barman, holding out the card as if it were a small fish whose soul had 3 weeks earlier winged its way to the land where fish are eternally blessed. "We don't accept it." Ford wondered briefly whether to raise the fact that he didn't have any other means of payment on him, but decided for the moment to soldier on. The disembodied hand was now grasping his shoulder lightly but firmly between its finger and thumb. "But you don't understand," said Ford, his expression slowly ripening from a little taken abackness into rank incredulity. "This is the American Express card. It's the finest way of settling bills known to man. Haven't you read their junk mail?" The cheery quality of Ford's voice was beginning to grate on the barman's ears. It sounded like someone relentlessly playing the kazoo during one of the more somber passages of a war requiem. One of the bones in Ford's shoulder began to grate against another one of those bones in his shoulder, in a way that suggested the hand had learned the principles of pain from a highly skilled chiropractor. He hoped he could get this business settled before the hand started to grate one of the bones in his shoulder against any of the bones in a different part of his body. Luckily, the shoulder it was holding was not the one he had a satchel slung over. The barman slid his card back across the bar at Ford. "We have never," he said with muted savagery, "heard of this thing." This was hardly surprising. Ford had only acquired it through a serious computer error toward the end of the 15-year sojourn he had spent on the planet Earth. Exactly how serious, the American Express Company had gotten to know very rapidly. And the increasingly strident and panic-stricken demands of its debt collection department were only silenced by the unexpected demolition of the entire planet by the Bogons to make way for a new hyperspace bypass. He had kept it ever since because he found it useful to carry a form of currency that no one would accept. "Credit," he said? These two words were usually coupled in the old Pink Dog Bar. "I thought," gasped Ford, "that this was meant to be a class establishment." He glanced around at the motley collection of thugs, pimps, and record company executives that skulked on the edges of the dim pools of light with which the dark shadows, the bar's inner recesses, were pitted. They were all very deliberately looking in any direction but his, carefully picking up the threads of their former conversations about murders, drug rings, and music publishing deals. They knew what would happen now, and they didn't want to watch it in case it put them off their drinks. "You gonna die, boy," murmured the barman quietly at Ford Prefect, and the evidence was on his side. The bar used to have hanging up one of those signs that read, "Please don't ask for credit, as a punch in the mouth often offends." But in the interest of strict accuracy, this was altered to, "Please don't ask for credit because having your throat torn out by a savage bird while a disembodied hand smashes your head against the bar often offends." However, this made an unreadable mess of the notice, and anyway didn't have the same ring to it, so it was taken down again. It was felt that the story would get about of its own accord, and it had. "Let me look at the bill again," said Ford. He picked it up and studied it thoughtfully under the malevolent gaze of the barman and the equally malevolent gaze of the bird, which was currently gouging great furrows in the bar top with its talons. It was a rather lengthy piece of paper. At the bottom of it was a number that looked like one of those serial numbers you find on the underside of stereo sets, which have always taken so long to copy onto the registration form. He had, after all, been in the bar all day, had been drinking lots of stuff with bubbles in it, and bought an awful lot of rounds for all the pimps, thugs, and record executives who suddenly couldn't remember who he was. He cleared his throat rather quietly and patted his pockets. There was, as he knew, nothing in them. He rested his left hand lightly but firmly on the half-opened flatch of his satchel. The disembodied hand renewed its pressure on his right shoulder. "You see," said the barman, and his face seemed to wobble evilly in front of Ford's, "I have a reputation to think of. You see that, don't you?" This is it, thought Ford. There was nothing else for it. He had obeyed the rules. He had made a bona fide attempt to pay his bill. It had been rejected. He was now in danger of his life. "Well," he said quietly, "if it's your reputation." In a sudden flash of speed, he opened his satchel, slapped down on the bar top his copy of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and the official card which said that he was a field researcher for the guide and absolutely not allowed to do what he was doing now. "Want a write-up?" The barman's face stopped in mid-wobble. The bird's talons stopped in mid-furrow. The hand slowly released its grip. "That," said the barman in a barely audible whisper between dry lips, "will do nicely, sir." Chapter 5. The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy is a powerful organ. Indeed, its influence is so prodigious that strict rules had to be drawn up by its editorial staff to prevent its misuse. So none of its field researchers is allowed to accept any kind of services, discounts, or preferential treatment of any kind in return for editorial favors unless they have made a bona fide attempt to pay for a service in the normal way, B, their lives would otherwise be in danger, or C, they really want to. Since invoking the third rule involved giving the editor a cut, Ford always preferred to muck about with the first two. He stepped out onto the street, walking briskly. The air was stifling, but he liked it because it was stifling city air, full of excitingly unpleasant smells, dangerous music, and the distant sound of warring police tribes. He carried a satchel with an easy swaying motion so that he could get a good swing at anybody who tried to take it from him without asking. It contained everything he owned, which at the moment wasn't much. A limousine careened down the street, dodging between the piles of burning garbage, and frightening an old pack animal which lurched, screeching, out of its way, stumbled against the window of an herbal remedies shop, set off a wailing alarm, blundered off down the street, and then pretended to fall down the steps of a small Italian restaurant where it knew it would get photographed and fed. Ford was walking north. He thought he was probably on his way to the spaceport, but he had thought that before. He knew he was going through that part of the city where people's plans often changed quite abruptly. "Do you want to have a good time?" said a voice from a doorway. "As far as I can tell," said Ford, "I'm having one, thanks." "Are you rich?" said another. This made Ford laugh. He turned and opened his arms in a wide gesture. "Do I look rich?" he said. "Don't know," said the girl. "Maybe, maybe not. Maybe you'll get rich. I have a special service for rich people." "Oh, yes," said Ford, intrigued but careful. "And what's that?" "I tell them it's okay to be rich." Gunfire erupted from a window high above them, but it was only a bass player getting shot for playing the wrong riff 3 times in a row, and bass players are 2 a penny in Hand-Old City. Ford stopped and peered into the dark doorway. "You what?" he said. The girl laughed and stepped forward a little out of the shadow. She was tall and had that kind of self-possessed shyness, which is a great trick if you can do it. "It's my big number," she said. "I have a master's degree in social economics, and I can be very convincing. People love it, especially in this city." "Goosenarg," said Ford Prefect, which was a special Beetlejuicean word he used when he knew he should say something, but he didn't know what it should be. He sat on a step, took from his satchel a bottle of that old jank spirit and a towel. He opened up the bottle and wiped the top of it with the towel, which had the opposite effect to the one intended, and that the old jank spirit instantly killed off millions of the germs which had been slowly building up quite a complex and enlightened civilization on the smellier patches of the towel. "Want some?" he said, after he'd had a swig himself. She shrugged and took the proffered bottle. They sat for a while, peacefully listening to the clamor of burglar alarms in the next block. "As it happens, I'm owed a lot of money," said Ford, "so if I ever get a hold of it, can I come and see you then, maybe?" "Sure," said the girl. "How much is a lot?" 15 years back pay. "For?" "Writing 2 words. "Zark one," said the girl. "Which one took all the time?" "The first one. Once I got that, the second one just kind of came one afternoon after lunch." A huge electronic drum kit hurtled through the window high above them and then smashed itself to bits on the street in front of them. It soon became apparent that some of the burglar alarms on the next block had been deliberately set off by one police tribe in order to lay an ambush for the other. Cars with screaming sirens converged on the area, only to find themselves being picked off by helicopters which came thudding through the air between the city's mountainous tower blocks. "In fact," said Ford, having to shout now above the din, "it wasn't quite like that. I wrote an awful lot, but they just cut it down." He took his copy of the guide back out of his satchel. "Then the planet got demolished," he shouted. "Really worthwhile job, eh? They've still got to pay me, though." "You work for that thing?" the girl yelled back. "Yeah. Good number." "You want to see the stuff I wrote," he shouted, "before it gets erased? The new revisions are due to be released tonight over the net. Someone must have found out the planet I spent 15 years on had been demolished by now. They missed it on the last few revisions, but it can't escape their notice forever." "It's getting impossible to talk, isn't it?" "What?" She shrugged and pointed upward. There was a helicopter above them, which now seemed to be involved in a side skirmish with the band upstairs. Smoke was billowing from the building. The sound engineer was hanging out the window by his fingertips, and the maddened guitarist was beating on his fingers with a burning guitar. The helicopter was firing at all of them. "Can we move?" They wandered down the street away from the noise. They ran into a city theater group who tried to do a short play for them about the problems of the inner city, but then gave up and disappeared into a small restaurant most recently patronized by the pack animal. All the time, Ford was poking at the interface panel of the guide. They ducked into an alleyway. Ford squatted on the garbage can while information began to flood over the screen of the guide. He located his entry: Earth, mostly harmless. Almost immediately, the screen became a mass of system messages. Here it comes, he said. Please wait, said the messages. Entries are being updated over the sub-Ethernet. This entry is being revised. The system will be down for 10 seconds. At the end of the alley, a steel gray limousine crawled past. Hey, look, said the girl. If you get paid, look me up. I'm a working girl, and there are people over there who need me. I gotta go. She brushed aside Ford's half-articulated protests and left him sitting dejectedly on his garbage can, preparing to watch a large swath of his working life be swept away electronically into the ether. Out in the street, things had calmed down a little. The police battle had moved off to other sectors of the city. The few surviving members of the rock band had agreed to recognize their musical differences and pursue solo careers. The street theater group was reemerging from the Italian restaurant with the pack animal, telling it they would like to take it to a bar they knew where it would be treated with a little respect. And a little way farther on the steel gray limousine was parked silently by the curb. She hurried toward it. Behind her, in the darkness of the alley, a green flickering glow was bathing Ford Prefect's face, and his eyes were slowly widening in astonishment. For where he had expected to find nothing, an erased, closed-off entry, there was instead a continuous stream of data: text, diagrams, figures and images, moving descriptions of surf on Australian beaches, yogurt on Greek islands, restaurants to avoid in Los Angeles, currency deals to avoid in Istanbul, weather to avoid in London, bars to go everywhere, pages and pages of it. It was all there, everything he had written. The deepening frown of blank incomprehension, he went backward and forward through it, stopping here and there at the various entries. Tips for aliens in New York. Land anywhere. Central Park. Anywhere. No one will care or indeed even notice. Surviving. Get a job as a cab driver immediately. A cab driver's job is to drive people anywhere they want to go in big yellow machines called taxis. Don't worry if you don't know how the machine works and you can't speak the language, don't understand the geography, or indeed the basic physics of the area, and have large green antennae growing out of your head. Believe me, this is the best way of staying inconspicuous. If your body is really weird, try showing it to people in the streets for money. Amphibious life forms from any of the worlds in the Swilling, Noxios, Nausilia systems will particularly enjoy the East River, which is said to be richer in those lovely life-giving nutrients than the finest and most virulent laboratory slime ever achieved. Having fun. This is a big section. It's impossible to have more fun without electrocuting your pleasure center. Ford flipped the switch, which he saw was marked Mode Execute Ready, instead of the old-fashioned Access Standby that had so long ago replaced the appallingly stone-aged Off. This was a planet he had seen completely destroyed, seen with his own two eyes, or rather, blinded as he had been by the hellish disruption of air and light, felt with his own 2 feet as the ground had started to pound at him like a hammer, bucking, roaring, gripped by tidal waves of energy pouring out of the loathsome yellow Vogon ships. And then at last, 5 seconds after the moment he had determined as being the last possible moment had already passed, he felt the gently swinging nausea of dematerialization as he and Arthur Dent had been beamed up through the atmosphere like a sports broadcast. There was no mistake. There couldn't have been. The Earth had definitely been destroyed. Definitely, boiled away into space. And yet here, he activated the guide again, was his own entry on how you would set about having a good time in Bournemouth, Dorset, England, which he had always prided himself on as being one of the most baroque pieces of invention he had ever delivered. He read it again and shook his head in sheer wonder. Suddenly he realized what the answer to the problem was. And it was this, that something very weird was happening. And if something very weird was happening, he thought, he wanted it to be happening to him. He stashed the guide back in his satchel and hurried out onto the street. Walking north again, he passed a steel gray limousine parked by the curb. From a nearby doorway, he heard a soft voice saying, "It's okay, honey. It's really okay. Got to learn to feel good about it. Look at the way the whole economy is structured." Ford grinned, detoured around the next block, which was now in flames, found a police helicopter that was standing unattended in the street, broke into it, strapped himself in, crossed his fingers, and sent it hurtling inexpertly into the sky. He weaved terrifyingly up through the canyoned walls of the cities. Once clear of them, hurtled through the black and red pall of smoke that hung permanently above it. 10 minutes later, with all the copter sirens blaring and its rapid-fire cannon blasting at random into the clouds, Ford Prefect brought it careening down among the gantries and landing lights at the hand-doled city spaceport, where it settled like a gigantic, startled, very noisy gnat. Since he hadn't damaged it too much, he was able to trade it in for a first-class ticket on the next ship leaving the system, and he settled into one of its huge, voluptuous, body-hugging seats. This was going to be fun, he thought to himself, as the ship blinked silently across the insane distances of deep space. The cabin service got into its full extravagant swing. "Yes, please," he said to the cabin attendants, wherever they glided up to offer him anything at all. He smiled with a curious kind of manic joy as he flipped again through the mysteriously reinstated entry on the planet Earth. He had a major piece of unfinished business that he would now be able to attend to, and he was terribly pleased that life had suddenly furnished him with a serious goal to achieve. It suddenly occurred to him to wonder where Arthur Dent was, and if he knew.